Okay, well, if you are a medical device manufacturer doing business in Europe, this next story is for you. In both the United States and Europe, medical devices must be tested to ensure certain essential requirements in terms of safety and effectiveness. That's the law. This testing is typically done by what are called, typically done by testing labs, and then those test results are, let's say, certified, for lack of a better word, by notified bodies. And notified bodies are similar to registrars, for those of you who are familiar with, let's say, ISO 9001. And there are a variety of standards to which notified bodies can test to or certify to, but for medical device safety, products are tested typically to IEC 60601-1, otherwise known as Medical Equipment, Medical Electrical Equipment, Part 1, General Requirements for Basic Safety and Essential Performance.
Easy for you to say.
In Europe, the European Commission does not require that a product be tested to any particular standard, only that it meets the essential safety requirements. Just the same, most notified bodies and device manufacturers test to 60601. But, and here's the function, where we're going today, what happens if, as a medical device manufacturer, you decide that you don't want to be tested to that standard? Well, here to talk about that issue is our guest, Grant Ramaley, Director of Regulatory Affairs for Aseptigo. Hello, Grant. How are you doing this morning?
Well, thank you, Dirk. Nice to be on the show.
Great. Well, okay. So, as I understand, this problem that I just mentioned kind of raised its head when 60601, third revision, that's the newest revision, came out. And I believe you said that your notified body told you that it was mandatory that you retest to that standard. Now, just to set the stage here, your company's products had already been tested and found safe and effective based on an earlier version of that standard. So there was no question that your product had been tested. It's been out in the field for a long time. Now there's just a newer version of 60601, and your notified body is telling your company, if I understand right, that, hey, you have to retest. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely right.
Okay, so there seems to be some confusion amongst notified bodies in what a voluntary standard is. So explain what it means to have a product tested to a voluntary standard.
Well, I just wanted to look into this a little more. And, when you talk about private law versus public law is, of course, the laws of the land, the code of federal regulation, and that sort of thing. Private laws are those things that we agree between organizations. So I can agree to use a standard like ISO, IEC, or I can agree not to. It's not a law, a public law, that I comply with that. The laws for CE marking, those are public laws, so we have to meet those. And those public laws say that standards drawn up by private law bodies are not mandatory.
So just to clarify here, what we're saying is that in Europe, if you're going to sell talking about Europe, if you're going to sell a medical device product in Europe, at some point it has to get a CE mark, right?
Absolutely.
And that CE mark is given to a medical device company by the notified body, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So they kind of hold the reins in terms of whether you can sell your product in Europe or not.
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's this voluntary standard, 60601. A new version comes out, and the notified bodies, from what I understand, are certain notified bodies, I'm not sure all of them are doing, but certain notified bodies are telling their clients, look, there's this new standard, third edition of 60601, you must be retested to that. And what happens, what are the notified bodies saying will happen if they don't retest to that?
Well, they can agree to withhold their CE mark and force the manufacturer to go look someplace else that doesn't require that conformity with a particular standard. So that is a choice that the manufacturer has with regard to CE marking. So it's somewhat of a voluntary arrangement between the manufacturer and their notified body as to whether they're going to agree to those kinds of terms.
And it's your position that this is totally wrong. And in fact, the European Commission, who oversees the medical device directive, which is basically the law in Europe, do I have that right?
That's correct.
And they disagree with the position of the notified bodies?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, a lot of the manufacturers that have had products on the market for quite a long time, someone I've talked to that had their product on the market for 20 years, and it's a very unique device. There's no alternative to it. In every way, it's the state of the art. It wasn't going to be available anymore in Europe because their notified body had demanded that they apply this new standard at an extraordinary cost of retesting that they just couldn't afford. So they were going to elect not to place that product on the market in Europe anymore. And they contacted the European Union, and the European Union told them to fire the notified body. There are other ways to go about meeting the essential requirements, and I assisted him a little bit in finding some help so that he could avoid having to the expensive retesting of the third edition and keep that product on the market where the doctors can still use it.
Grant, you mentioned the term state-of-the-art there, and I think that that's part of what's happening here is there's maybe a little bit of confusion, or there's not a lot of clarity maybe in terms of what state-of-the-art means. I mean, the notified bodies could look at this and say, well, you need to retest or recertify because we need to ensure that the products coming into Europe are state-of-the-art. Would that be an argument that the notified bodies perhaps would make?
Well, that is the argument that they're using, and it's a legal requirement in Annex 1, Paragraph 2 of the Medical Device Directive 9342 EEC that the product meets state-of-the-art in terms of safety and whatnot. So, you know, when you look at how it is that manufacturer decides to meet that state-of-the-art requirement, of course, there's no requirement to meet a particular standard. And they just need to address that requirement. The notified bodies have more narrowly defined state-of-the-art as being attached to compliance with later versions of standards, of the voluntary standards that emerge for availability. And of course, that's something that the regulators don't agree with, because the regulators got together and the Global Harmonization Task Force and wrote a very concise document explaining the role of standards in conformity assessment, and very plainly said that there are many different alternatives to using voluntary standards, and that products that have been on the market and safe and effective for quite a long time don't need to be retested to those new standards.
Grant, we're getting short on time here, but tell us briefly, if you will, kind of what you're kind of going through this whole thing in this back and forth, or your notified body. Kind of tell us briefly the history of what's going on with you regarding this quote requirement from your notified body that you have to meet the latest edition.
Yeah, we came in and we faced the same situation. I had been talking to our notified body a couple of years before about some concerns I had about the third edition's ability to actually satisfy the legal requirements. And so we elected to use, as we have been in the past, several standards. We use about 5 different harmonized standards to meet the essential requirements. And when they came in, they saw that we didn't apply the third edition, and they wrote us up a critical nonconformity for not meeting the requirement for state-of-the-art. And at the same time, I forwarded it on to the European Commission, and they complained to the notified body on my behalf.
So you actually contacted, who was it at the European Commission?
Manfred Kohler.
And what's his position?
He's the Directorate General of the European Commission over the health and that department there that covers medical devices.
So basically he's the guy at the European Commission who oversees this kind of stuff.
Yes, and they had already been looking at 60601 third edition and finding some problems with it. So this just added to the complications that they were having with regard to that standard.
Okay, so you contacted Manfred Kohler, and what did he do?
No, he contacted the notified body and says you can't require the manufacturers meet these standards because the standards are voluntary standards. So that's what I was told by Manfred. He had told them, and of course he just reiterated the position of the European Commission and especially with the notified bodies, that they cannot force manufacturers to apply newer versions of the standard to meet the legal requirements for state-of-the-art. It's too narrow of a position that they don't agree with.
Okay. Well, Grant, we're actually out of time here. This is actually really interesting. I think we're going to keep following up on this with you in terms of what's going on. But the upshot is, what you're saying is basically a company could do what you do, is if you believe your notified body is telling you to, that they're requiring you to retest to a certain standard, you can either go to another notified body or you can duke it out with them referring to this information from the European Commission, Manfred Kohler.
That's true.
Okay. Well, Grant, thanks for joining us. Sorry we have to cut it short, but we'll hook up with you again.
All right. Thank you very much, Dirk.
Okay, thanks, Grant.
Thanks, Grant.